We recently had a question on our YouTube channel as to whether or not we had an example that had both a stacked graph, like the one that you see here, that also included a break, like the one that you see here, where notice on the x-axis, there's actually a break in the axis, and the scale is in fact also different on the left side and the right side. So we found a lot of examples that we had of stacked graphs. We found a lot of examples of graphs with breaks in them, but we didn't find the intersection of the two. And that's what we've gone ahead and we've added. So there's a new example file that I'm going to walk you through that has a graph just like this, where we have both stacked graphs and we have a break in the x direction. The new example file that we've added is in the layout section of the DataGraph examples. And you'll see there's a whole bunch of different files here with a variety of different types of layouts, splits in different directions, axis breaks. But the one we're going to focus on is the one that is now right at the top of the list that I just added, the stacked graphs with axis break. So let's open this file and go ahead and talk a little bit about what you see in here. First of all, there are two graphs. The one that has both the stacked lines graphs in the y direction as well as the break that's over here in the x direction. So if you look at this, you'll notice how to the left of this break, there's a different scale going from 0 to 45, and then on the right-hand side, the scale is much narrower. I will say that in general, sometimes people maybe overuse axis breaks or don't use them properly, so be careful when you choose to use these, that you're not distorting the data and that there's a good reason for using an axis break. For this particular data set, this was actually already in our example files in an example that had stacked graphs, in fact, stacked histograms. And so I just grabbed this data. I thought it actually was a good one to use for this because you have three different signals where they all have a different X range. And maybe we just want to focus in on the part of the data where all three signals are present. And that's essentially what I did here by creating the graph that has the axis break over on the side. A couple of other things that I want to show you here before I start showing you how to do this. If you look over on the left-hand side, there's a variable called break. If you want to go ahead and move that around, then what you'll notice is that it's changing the location of the break itself. I will show you how you can set that up. The other thing that I have here is another variable. This is just simply called W. And if you move this, notice it has a narrow range. It's just 1 to 3. You could, I guess, make it a little bit wider, but you really have to, when you drag it, make sure you mean it to get it to go between these different integers. And it is set to integer values because as you're moving it, maybe you're noticing, it's changing the line width for each of my lines. I really like to set up a variable for this when I have multiple plot commands that I'm using because it allows me then to change all the line widths at the same time. And as you will see, when I set up the axis break, I'm actually repeating these three plot commands 3 more times. And that's how I get it drawn on both sides of this axis. So it is a good idea to think ahead when you're making your plots as to how you want them formatted before you start making the breaks and duplicating the commands. All right, but what we're going to start first is I'm first going to show you how to make the stacked graphs as you see here. To start, what I would recommend doing is just creating a new file. You can do that under File, New, and copying and pasting this data in there. So to just start from scratch. That's what I'm going to do. So I'm going to hold my Shift key, highlight all this data. I can copy it to my clipboard, go into this brand new file, and go ahead and paste this in. The first thing that I'm going to do is just create these plots. Now, if you notice in the original data, I only have Y data. The X data here is in fact going to be my row number. And to do this, the way that I would recommend is go ahead and select each column individually and then click the plot command. So that makes 1 plot, 2 plots, and 3 plots. you'll notice that the X value is the number symbol, which is our row number. That's the object that's represented over here at the top of all of our data columns, which is always there. Okay, so what else do I want to do here? Well, I'm going to create my splits, and I do that over here in the Canvas settings. You'll see split X and split Y. Go ahead and click split Y 2 times. When you do, you will notice there's essentially 2 different things that happen here. 2 objects get added, which represent each one of the new y-axes that I created. And they'll have an icon here on the right that indicates which one they correspond to. So the bottom one here corresponds to this top axis, and here's the middle one. Okay, the other thing that you'll see is on your commands themselves, there is now an indicator of where the commands are being drawn, and this is an interactive selector, so I can just click on these and change where these commands are drawing the data to. That's great. Now I have my stacked axis. Other things that I want to do here is change the color. And I showed you how I had that slider variable for the line width, because otherwise the line width for each one of these would be something we would have to set individually. And I want to make it easy for myself as I make more and more of these. Notice, for example, that the line width throughout the entire graph is set with this pen variable. So I can change this, and that will make all of my lines thicker. But again, I want to control just the lines themselves. So one technique that I use all the time is to create a variable, and this is this slider variable that I had. And again, I'll just say 1 to 3. I'm going to make this an integer. And I'm going to actually use an expression here where I multiply that times whatever the value of pen is. So W times pen for each one of these. Oops, let me copy this whole thing here. Copy and paste and paste. So now I can change the line width independently for each of my lines. The other thing that I want you to notice here, and this is just particular to this type of data, this is sort of noisy data. So if I do have a thicker line, you'll notice that the ends here can get very sharp and they can actually extend out. If you happen to have that situation, this is just an opportunity to show you how to deal with that. You can go in and you can change what's called the line join from miter to bevel. So notice what happens when I change this. I'm changing this top one here. It takes that away. So you can go ahead and change this for all 3, since this is something I had done for all of this data. Now it's all set to bevel. And again, I just make the point that, you know, as you're doing this, think about what you want your lines to look like, or whatever it is that you're putting in your stacked graphs, and try and get them as close to final as possible before you make the split axes. So now I'm pretty happy with what these look like, and I'll show you next how to do the split. Now I'm going to show you how to create the split. And the key here is that we actually do this in a very similar way to creating the stacked axis. We're going to use the split X, and that's going to create a second graph region here, second X-axis, that we can place information on that and restrict the range of what data is shown there. And this is why we actually are repeating our commands. This is the reason why I was saying, you know, try and make sure your command is close to what you would like it to be before you start doing the split, because we're going to duplicate each one of these. So to do this, what I recommend when you have multiple commands that you want to have, where you have stacked and split, is to highlight them and then place them in a group. I'm going to call this group left. I'm going to clone this group, so I'll hold down my Option key. Let me let you see what I am doing here. Hold down the Option key, click and drag this down. This will make a clone. We'll call this one right. And you'll just see these are the same commands repeated, but I want to move these over to the right-hand side. And because they're in a group, there is a handy shortcut on the gear menu of the group when you have split axes that allows you to select an axis to move the data to. So we're going to move all these duplicated commands over to axis 2. And now we have both duplicated, and we're going to restrict the range of each one to reflect the graph that we're recreating. So first, before I do that, I just want to show you a little bit about this object right here. So this is what's controlling my second x-axis that I created. And if you open this up, notice that there is a width option that has a slider. And if it's 1, it basically means that whatever available space this split section has, it will take that up. But if I say I want this to be 1/3 of that, then it's going to be much smaller. Or again, you can use the slider to adjust it how you like. So now we're getting closer to looking like the original graph. But what you'll see is that my axis boxes are all drawn individually. And one of the things that we changed actually in the more recent version of DataGraph is to have the axis box style be these individual boxes. But if I am going to add the axis break, let me show you this right here. So this is the space on left, says medium, and I want to change this to a break. What you'll see initially is that nothing happens. So if you're used to changing this, there's 2 things you have to change. You have to add the break, and then you also have to change the box style. You can change the box style in the style settings. So if you open that up, you'll see there is an option for box style. And we just really haven't figured out how to effectively show a break here, like it's typical in graphs. So change the box style into 1 box, for example. And when you do that, now you see this break symbol that is shown here on the graph. And what else did I want to show you here? And again, I can change this width and move where the break is located. I might as well just go ahead and do that. But let's, for now, leave that at 1/3. Now, the next thing that I need to do is I need to set the range for what data am I going to show on either side. And one quick way to do that is actually just to go to the graph, click and drag. So you have to click and keep dragging. You have to really let the program know you mean it. And then over here, I can click and drag the part of the data that only has the Y1 signal and the Y3 signal. Now I'm getting a graph very similar to the one that's in your example file, except there's one thing. So when I click and drag, what I'm essentially doing is I'm restricting the range of the x-axis in both of these regions. And what you see here is actually, this is where the restrict is shown, whatever it is I'm selected here. So if I even hover over the axis, you get this status bar or axis bar that you can click and drag to change it. But I want to, often for an axis break, you want the break to be at the same location in both the left and the right. So you could type in the same location. For example, here, if I wanted the axis break at 45, I can do that. And then I'd go into my main axis, and you'd see this is controlling now the left-hand side. What is the maximum that's shown here? So I could also type this in as 45. Or I could do what I did in the example file, which is add that slider, which allows me to change them both interactively. And you can see this is how this works here. So here's the break slider that now, if you set this up, you'll go into the file and you'll see the variable break is shown here, and it's also shown here. And now it's changing these both together. Just a couple of other details I wanted to go over that I think would be helpful for you as you're working with these graphs. First one is related to the X title. So as you see here, in the stacked graph, I typed in the X title right here in the axis settings. And you can see it's centered below the graph in the graph itself. But I did not do that in the graph with the break. You'll notice that here, in fact, because I split the x-axis, there are 2 places where you could theoretically type an X title. And if you did, let me just type in 1 here and 2 here. What you see is, here's the titles that I typed in, oops, and they are centered beneath each of those x-axes that I created. But if you want one overall axis label, like I do here, then you can't adjust the location of the axis labels you type within the axis settings. Instead, you can add a text command. That's what's here at the bottom of these commands. And in that text command, I've set the where to X title. I have it centered, but notice that there's also an offset here, which is something that I can move around. So I can go ahead and drag this one and place it. If I centered it or had the offset set to 0, it will still center on the left side because it is associated with whichever x-axis I select here. But again, since I can drag this into the center and I have fixed my size of my graph, as you can see up here, now it's going to stay put, and it gives me an overall title for this graph. The last thing that I'm going to say is, if you've never seen this technique before, I can go back to this one here, where I'm multiplying an integer value times the pen for a line width. That might seem a little odd, but I don't know. I kind of like this technique. I could have just created a completely different variable with a slider that had a range of the line width that I wanted. But here, the reason I like this is because if I change the pen width and I want all my lines a little bit bigger, I can go ahead and do that, or have them all be very small. But then I still have this individual control for the data lines of my plot commands if I want them to be just ever so slightly thicker than the rest of the lines in my graph. Anyway, I hope that this was helpful for you, both in terms of learning maybe a little bit more formatting, as well as obviously learning more about stacking and creating these axis breaks. And any other questions, let us know.